Welcome everybody to this Geomedia speaker series seminar. And today our topic is datafication and migration. And I'm really excited of this panel. We have great speakers today. Sandra Ponzanesi and Mark Latonero, Martina Tazzioli, and Anna Valdivia are all going to talk today, each about 20 minutes on this topic from their own perspectives. And the whole idea, of course, of this seminar came about from the fact that datafication has become such a big issue, and it has been shaping more and more our everyday lives. But then, particularly in migration, it has it's been also an issue of great concern, and there is increasing amount of research done in this field at the moment, both in media studies, critical data studies, and migration studies. So the idea was to bring these discussions together with leading scholars who have done research in this field quite a while now. We want to kind of interrogate through this seminar the aspects of datafication as a kind of surveillance, increasingly automated vehicle of surveillance, but then also a kind of everyday aspect that is connected to digital media as something that is also for migrants and refugees, for example, an important aspect of aid, advice, information, connection, and so on. So this sort of contradiction and ambivalence is something we are also interested in. And this is something that I'm also myself particularly interested in my current research, and I'm sure everyone who's joining us in this seminar are really interested in the presentations we are about to hear, and that shed light to this phenomenon in a kind of more also in a global context. So this seminar proceeds so that I introduce each speaker first, and they speak one after another, and after that we will have discussion and questions through the chat. So please, if you have questions, put them in chat, and then me and Lena Grip, who is coordinator of the seminar series, can also take notes of the questions, and we can then discuss them. And if I didn't already say, my name is Kaarina Nikunen, and I'm the visiting professor here at Karlstad and hosting this seminar today. So let us start with Sandra Ponzanesi's presentation. Sandra is professor of media, gender, and postcolonial studies at Utrecht University, and she has quite a long time. She's been working in the field of migration and media studies, and she is also PI that deals with digital crossings in Europe, gender, diaspora, and belonging, which is quite central to this topic that we have today. So please, Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kaarina, and everyone. I'm very excited to be here with this cohort. Let me see if I manage. Yeah. Can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah. So thank you, Kaarina, for the invitation, and Grip for the organization. And it's very nice to see all colleagues, Mark and Martina, and to meet Anna today, this Geomedia speaker series. So I'm speaking from a position with a project which has reached its conclusion, but it's still like spinning and spanning ideas and research. So I will try to give an overview of what is my positioning within the field of migration and mobility studies, and then briefly give a summing up of the main take and insight that we achieved with this 5-year ERC research that Kaarina just mentioned. And then I'll try to draw some of the conclusion also in relation to this speaker series and the idea of everyday life and datafication. So the word has always been on the move. That the word has always been on the move is to state the obvious. Yet the level through which the movement is allowed or curtailed indicates many of the imbalances and inequalities that are implicated in the right to move, migrate, or resettle. Furthermore, questions of immobility are often gendered and ethnically connotated. Globalization not only heightened the speed and scale of movement and traveling, but it has also exacerbated the disparities among fellow humans and the right to move. This has also been caused by the weakening of the nation states and the rise of multinational capital that exploit labor across borders. Diaspora studies are, of course, quite intensively connected to these issues of mobility and whether it is voluntary, force, or even reach the level of expulsion, as Saskia Sassen has taught us. In the kaleidoscopic documentary, The Human Flow, that you see here, Ai Weiwei points out to the staggering scale of the refugee crisis, with 65 million people, by now 70, around the world as refugees, who have been forced to leave their home to escape famine, war, and climate change, making a dire visual commentary on the disproportionate opportunity that mobility gives to people from the global south. Despite this number, migration studies have come under fire in recent years, accused of focusing too narrowly on certain types of migrants, usually underprivileged ones, and state-led integration in northern countries of settlement. It can certainly be discussed whether such criticism is fair or not, as it ignores many critical theoretical and empirical insight made in the enormous corpus of migration studies during the last decades. Nevertheless, I do find that the point of expanding the analytical attention to several modes of mobility, immobility, and mobile subjectivity is important when analyzing diaspora, especially in relation to new digital media. Hence, the keyword mobility is an important one to consider next to that of migration. Okay, oh yeah, sorry. This is because the right to mobility and the reality of migration seems to be pertaining to two different fields of inquiry. And whereas mobility was originally a Western-based idea of the right to be mobile, not just in terms of transportation, but also social housing and cultural economic status, the so-called upward social mobility, migration often associated with forced migration implies more a disenfranchised and governmental disposition of group and bodies at global scales and marked by victimhood and alterity. However, in the last decade, the two fields, mobility and migration, have become increasingly intertwined and more informed by each other, intervention and articulation of spatiality as well as subjectivity. Mobility studies, which was originally more focused on geography and urban studies, has increasingly included issues of race, social justice, and equality in its theoretical underpinning, therefore taking into account uneven and unequal mobilities. While migration study has increasingly focused on the right of the migrant to control and determine its own mobility, right to self-determination, often defined as the autonomy of migration, therefore moving away from passive and negative attitude. The scope of this talk is to ultimately bring about a dialogue between migration and digital technology in order to re-signify the experience of displacement as transformed by the affordances of new media technology, making mobility a more informed field and digital migration a more user-oriented approach. People's mobility, as broadly defined, is a term that refers to the agency to be mobile and to choose whether to move or stay put. Mobility studies with emphasis on agency, capital, regime, and stratification enriching current understanding of globalization, transnationalism, political economy, the role of city and circulation, as Salazar has said to us. So this so-called mobility study started to emerge around the turn of the century to analyze how society moved through the examination of multiple mobile phenomena at the global and local level. Declaring a new mobility paradigm, Scheller and Urey aim to challenge sedentarism and container model as coined by Albert Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, when nation, society, territory, culture, and identity are assumed to correspond and neatly fit with each other, and mobility is regarded as a deviance or ignored. So you can see that it's from 2005, and they have a journal dedicated to this. Mimi Scheller and John Urey, the prominent figure of this field, published in 2005 this article on new mobility paradigms, taking into consideration new advances in the field beyond the right to mobility in the traditional sense, but linked to new environmental, technological, epidemic, and security global challenges. Mobility entails in its original coinage more than physical motion, but it is understood as a socio-cultural phenomenon through which people advance in their upward social mobility, not just in terms of space, but get access to better infrastructure and opportunities. So to quote them, the new mobilities paradigm suggests a set of questions, theories, and methodology rather than a totalizing or reductive description of the contemporary world. Thus, the new paradigm attempts to account for not only the quickening of liquidity within some realm, but the concomitant pattern of concentration that creates zone of connectivity, centrality, and empowerment in some cases, and of disconnection, social exclusion, inaudibility in other cases. This, therefore, not a question of privileging a mobile subjectivity, but rather of tracking the power discourses and practices of mobility in creating both movement and stasis. A further important contribution to mobility studies comes from Mimi Scheller, who in a more recent mobility justice, expand the traditional understanding of mobility studies to focus more on issues of power, inequality, and justice, making uneven mobility and mobility rights, ethics, and justice central to the field. Mobility justice originated in the Caribbean context, drawing from sociology, cultural geography, and critical theory. It brings forward differential mobility and consider an intersectional approach to see how social identity marker influence accessibility and interact with the mobility regime and control systems. So the concept of mobility justice take our attention beyond the uneven geography of transport, urbanism, and the imaginary of the network city to a wider terrain on uneven movement and managed mobility grounded in colonial hierarchy with all the resistance, backlashes, and violence. Uneven mobility are crucial to the form of elite secession, territorial appropriation, and resource extraction that build colonial worlds and were braided into ongoing forms of power that underwrite the mobile production of contemporary global inequalities. So as mentioned above, for Mimi Scheller, the struggle for mobility justice takes place against the backdrop of what she called the tribal crisis of climate change, migration, and unsustainable form of rapid urbanization. All three crises have created their own yet overlapping patterns of mobility and immobility. Scheller explores how mobility regime intersect with a more general political condition of injustice. As the author puts it, mobility justice is an overarching concept for thinking about how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement, shaping the patterns of unequal mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, resources, and information. Therefore, we are in the presence of differential mobility, difference in mobility, which reflect and reinforce existing power structure. What is important to consider is not only the general rights to mobility, but what many critics have called the autonomy of migration. And there is a list of people who are part of this movement and understanding, among which Martina Tazzioli, who's here with us today, Nicolas De Genova, and Sandra Mezzarda, and many others. So the proponent of the autonomy of migration have advanced the proposition that migration should be understood as a social movement in an objective sense. It offers a distinct way for thinking about border control mechanism and goals of managing mobility. Autonomy of migration does not read this offshoring of borders through the lens of centralized and coordinated state power, but develop an autonomous case that supplement this institutional reading of apparatuses of control with a view that takes as its starting point the way in which border architecture, institutions, and policies interact with and react to the turbulence of migrant mobilities. It therefore articulates the shifting relation between border control, and mobility. Autonomy of migration theories are helpful to depict borders as places of ongoing conflict, subjectivity, and transformation, which allow to explore migrant alternative imaginaries. And transformation, which allow to, against biometric border control and social technical constraints, autonomy of migration theory enable a deeper understanding of mobility and migration as linked to instances of self-creation, spurred by radical imaginings and driven by change, where the subjective dimension of migration inform both meaning of autonomy as well as alternative imaginary. So according to Genova, one of the main theorists and sustainer of the autonomy of migration, it remains vital to discern the autonomous force and subjective versatility of migrants and refugees who continuously recalibrate their own strategies and tactics in the agonistic effort to realize their mobility. So even against the considerable forces aligned to immobilize the migratory projects, which might be greater or lesser extent compel them to revert to a kind of standby mode of tactical waiting, migrant subjective autonomy remained an incorrigible force. And waiting to be reactivated, the mobility remains an intractable and always potentially disruptive constitutive power. So the autonomy of migration is inherently and objectively political, in so much as migrant or refugee can be understood to act in a manner that asserts the primacy of their human needs over and against the border, the police, the law, and the state. So De Genova refers therefore to these two key figures, the autonomy of migration and the tactics of bordering, as centrally and mutually constitutive of the agonistic, if not antagonistic drama of the global border regime. To designate the primacy of human mobility as migration, De Genova continues, already naturalizes the existence of border, serve to produce spatial differences between one formation and the other, inside and outside. So constructing the very profoundly consequential difference between the presumably proper subject of the state's authority and those mobile human beings, variously branded as alien, foreign, and indeed migrants. So it is important to remember here that if there were no borders, there would be no migration, but only mobility. Indeed, such borders have acquired significance and materiality as part of the state power response to human movement. Yet, as De Genova reminds us, the mobility of people around the world came first, and therefore it has primacy and the right to exist. The multifarious attempt to manage or control this autonomous mobility have always come as a response. What presents itself as autonomy of migration, therefore, is finally but a particular manifestation of a more elementary and elemental exercise of the human freedom of movement. So it is really a kind of statement, political statement and socialist movement. So now we have explored how both terms of mobility and migration have slowly converged to include the rights of mobility within the field of migration studies and include a perspective of social justice within mobility studies. The above fields converge and diverge again in relation to the application of the new digital technologies and the way in which connectivity enhances mobility and belonging, but also create new forms of disparities and control. I would now like to discuss briefly the approach and finding that we gather with the IRC project Connecting Europe, in which both question of mobility and migration are set central through the perspective of fluid diasporic formation. The ERC project Connecting Europe, Digital Crossing in Europe, Gender, Diaspora and Belonging focuses on female migrants, diaspora from Somalia, Turkey and Romania living in 3 of Europe's main metropolitan centers. You can see here sketchy London, Amsterdam and Rome. As the hubs, they connect different history, waves and form of migration, the post-colonial, the post-socialist and the refugee. It analyzes women as connecting user and therefore as active participant of social media platform. It focuses on migrant women for 2 reasons. First of all, because the increasing feminization of migration, and secondly, because women are traditionally less visible in the public sphere, especially the digital sphere. A study on women's online practices allow us to tap into the everyday experiences and emotions, something that usually remains under the radar of the mainstream media and the public debate. So among the other, we focus therefore on the use of digital media as part of everyday life. And these are some of the questions that we're leading. How do migrant women stay in touch with communities, both close by and more distant? So not only the diaspora, but also the neighborhood. What form do diasporic connection take online or via social media platform? The difference between intimacy or more political participation, and how a new form of co-presence and digital intimacy sustained transnationally. So it has to do with affective belonging and how emotion can be theorized and perceived online. So the non-media-centric approach reflects an increased interest in using digital media in ethnography research, countering many of the claims of big data, and we connect to the topic of the day, and study how digital media are involved in the formation of community rather than their replacement online. In our approach, we therefore propose a complication of the idea of connectivity, revising the notion that social media platforms radically transform transnational social formation, and challenging the notion that the impact of social media is uniform across cases. In particular, we try to rethink the notion of digital diaspora and how migrant women participate in them without falling into methodological nationalism or ethnic clanism. This presupposing not so much a paradox in wanting to define a corpus while also avoiding identity politics and fixed categories, but an ethnographic effort that would allow digital diaspora to emerge not only as bottom-up configuration, but also as multi-layered, multi-sided and scalar. We follow in this Edward Glissant's notion of the poetic of relation. The Caribbean thinker offers sites of connectivity instead of fixed places of origin and of roots as a way to conceive multiple coexisting and layered histories. Methodologically, the project has foregrounding an ethnographic approach that emphasizes the everyday dimension of diasporic digital practices. The internet was seen not just as a media or a platform with specific affordances, but a set of practices that emerge through the user participation, focuses on people experience and contributing to the production of an interactive digital sociality, a form of autonomy of social media use. Rather than focusing on the abstract capabilities of the medium specificity of the internet, ethnography helps to understand digital media as part of everyday practices, but situating in particular context and revealing the socially diverse practices and engagement of different groups and generations. In particular, for migrant women, the use of digital media is strongly embedded in their gender role as mothers, daughters, and reunited wives, students and professional, expats, who keep the ties with the homeland and diaspora community through specific digital strategies and tactics in ways that we wanted to explore and focus on. Our effort to trace some of the connection between sites of dispersion is therefore partly also an attempt to understand media flows that fall outside the historical north-south colonial directionality of mass communication. As a project finding suggests, the digital enhancement of interconnection between diaspora sites is not taking place in any straightforward way. Like many diaspora, migrants, Somali, Turkish, and Romania have settled in multiple urban locales as communities that are visible to a greater or lesser extent. We thus embrace Cindy Hoare's notion of multi-sided embeddedness, which highlights how the diasporic people relate to multiple sites of belonging through their civic engagement. Therefore, another important aspect is the question of urban belonging and translocality. The focus on digital media practices and the everyday acknowledges how spatiality plays a crucial role in the production of practices of belonging at the crossroad between the urban, the national, and the transnational. The concept of translocality accounts for the way in which national and transnational spaces become entangled in the co-constitution of situated everyday life worlds that materialize in particular localities and urban contexts. Carpentier argues, for example, that while the urban has its own locally situated dynamics, media organizes and transforms the local through broader national and transnational formation. Locality is shaped at the level of the city in which the everyday life and culture of migrant women are articulated. Yet locality also considers the different scale through which diasporic women articulate their experiences and emotion, including through the use of digital media to negotiate urban, national, and transnational belonging, and the symmetry of power it generates. So as Floya Antias writes, a translocational lens attends to the spatial, temporal, and scalar aspects within which intersection of power and embedded, as well as the broader social context. The term translocational also denotes a differential positioning and belonging across intersection location, and that these are not static. So to bring back to my conclusion, and the question of mobility and migration in relation to diasporic digital practices, we can conclude that though the mobility and migration terms belong to different genealogies and scholarly debates, they are reconfigured online, becoming part of wider debates on participation, agency, and co-creation versus surveillance, algorithmic culture, and datafication. So if the mobility term breaks down the taken for granted notion of national belongings and fixed abode, the migration term focuses on displacement and disarray caused by increased border regime, policing, and surveillance. Without border, there will be not migration, just mobility. And therefore, the autonomy of migration with the rights to mobility as a human rights for all, in a way rearranges the divide between who is allowed to stay and who is trespassing. As the digital in theory knows boundaries, it complicates the question of mobility and migration as neat categories. The internet is not an extraterritorial space, but an elastic and ambiguous space that supports new form of imaginaries and multiple forms of diasporic belonging. Digital media sociality is experienced as a continuum through the course marked by the complex intersection of technology, spatiality, and emotion, which takes into account different affordances and digital strategies. So as we write in an article, we say digital diaspora are mutually constituted here and there through bodies and data across borders and network, online and offline, by user and platform, through material, symbolic, and emotional practices that all reflective of intersecting power relations. This means that while it is important to pay attention to the specific affordances and the properties of digital technology and social media platform, It is also essential to highlight the role of the user and the way people in the diaspora experience and appropriate digital media to shape the world. In this way, digital media becomes a way to exert not only the rights to mobility for those who have access, cultural capital, and digital literacy, but also for those who are usually perceived as less tech-savvy or disenfranchised. As we have argued in a project, migrants do heavily rely on digital technologies for different purposes, from curating intimate relationship to long-distance political participation, operating at different scale, local and global. Despite the looming dangers of surveillance, algorithmic control, and data sorting, the internet remains a space where the right to mobility is claimed not only in the infrastructural sense, but also as an imaginary aspiration. So when Nikunen is described as high-tech Orientalism, the exotification of Asian and digitally skilled migrants through technology, perceived as anomalous and therefore suspicious and less deserving of refugee rights. In this contested label, we see the origin of mobility studies and migration studies converge around the idea that the digital is by default a signifier of the West, wealthy and educated, a rather Eurocentric and misleading perception, as Orientalism has always been in the first place. So the intervention proposes to study the role of media from a bottom-up perspective, migrant youth engagement with technology, for the purpose of acquiring agency, finding expression, establishing new connection, and maintaining bonds with the homelands in the everyday engagement. This perspective allows us to rethink the ways in which the digital diaspora are constituted, sustained, and negotiated at the local and transnational level. It is therefore important to focus on the spatial and conceptual term chosen and their application not as a normative, but as relational, meaning in conversation with each other's definition. All is fluid, negotiable, and porous, as Glissant has taught us. This is just the end of it, and a slide about the project if you're interested to know more. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sandra. This was such a great beginning for the discussion and the conceptual approach of where we are now. Really wonderful. Thank you. So we will now move on to our next speaker. And as I said earlier, for some people have arrived later, that we will take the questions in the end of these talks. But you can, meanwhile, you can put them in the chat if you have questions. So we will then go through them later on. So our next speaker then is Mark Latonero. He's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Mark Latonero's work has been, his research focuses on different kind of benefits, risks, and harms of data and AI technology, particularly in context of refugees. And he's also an advisor for the UNHCR, and he has written done influential work on the idea of digital passage. And today he'll talk about surveillance, humanitarianism, and displacement. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kaarina. And thank you to Karlstad University and Lena as well for the invitation. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you and colleagues and friends, fellow panelists. Why don't I share my screen? If you can let me know if it's working, that would be great. All set?
Yes, looks great.
Great. Excellent. So my name is Mark Latonero. I work at the intersection of emerging technology and human rights, and also in AI governance. And today, what I'd like to do in a short amount of time that we have together is to sort of take you on a progression sorts, of my ideas and research, of which datafication and migration has played a central role. And this is based on research I've done with the help of many others at Data and Society, where I led the Data and Human Rights program, also as a recent fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. But let me just say that these ideas and thoughts are my own and don't represent any of the organizations or institutions I'm affiliated with now or in the past. So what I'd like to do is sketch out something of a through line, so to speak, across several overlapping areas of my work over the last, hard to believe now, but about 5 or 6 years. And this sort of work has spanned, scholarship and research to developing strategies to inform and influence policymakers and also practitioners as well. And so what I'm going to do is just a quick overview. I'll start with the role of data-driven technology in the migration and refugee context, which is most appropriate for this conversation, and how that sort of led me to understand this idea of surveillance humanitarianism, particularly amongst displaced people. And then think a little bit more about technological experimentation on people in vulnerable circumstances. Then I'll move to AI governance and the importance of human rights and dignity and how that's related to that work. Then concerns about surveillance humanitarianism at scale, which is more relevant today, I would argue, than in any other time. And so, I imagine this group, of course, there's a number of academic researchers. So let me just start by highlighting the importance of research into the deployment and development of data-driven technologies and algorithmic systems in the migration context. And sort of research in general on how technologies are impacting those who find themselves in these circumstances. And so about 5 years ago or 6 years ago now, at Data and Society and also the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, we released a report called Refugee Connectivity, which is based on fieldwork at a Syrian refugee camp in Greece. And this was a quantitative sort of survey methodology, but also qualitative as well. And this is just the idea that what we saw, particularly at that time, and it's even more so now, there were a number of technological interventions by international organizations and others, but they were being deployed without any real evidence base. And so the argument really was, without research to ground these interventions, it risks doing more harm to the populations that they purported to serve. And so really basic things that we found out in our research, in our interviews, and our survey research, things like, amongst the refugees, the Syrian refugees that we interviewed, there was a mistrust of different platforms. And Facebook was sort of used by most refugees that we interviewed, but that didn't mean that platform was sort of trusted. They just had little choice on what else to use. Another finding that we had is that privacy is important to the refugees that we talked to, which, it still amazes me. At the time, there was a big debate on whether, companies and others should care about refugee privacy online. And also, kind of echoing Sandra's work, we found gender differences with regard to technology diffusion and ownership. So in other words, a number of organizations were creating apps for those who might be subjected to gender-based violence. However, we found that a discrepancy between ownership of the cell phone. A lot of sort of quote-unquote households that we interviewed, families, the men were the owners of the phone, and the women borrowed those phones. And so, understanding how research plays a role was sort of very important in the formulation of some of my ideas. And this sort of was extended to another report that we did at Data and Society along with some other amazing colleagues, which has had to do with digital identity and these digital identity systems. And in this study. We did field work in Italy and went to a number of locations there. But of course, at the time and even now, digital identity sort of systems were being developed and deployed as an answer to migration, cross-border migration, and essentially tracking refugees as they sort of moved from one place to the other. Without the understanding that despite the best intentions, there is a socio-technical layer which is introduced when these digital identity systems are deployed, which can exacerbate biases, discrimination, and power imbalances. And so, as an example, this picture, which was taken at a refugee shelter and camp near the French border in Italy. What you see here is an international organization which is running the camp to, I guess it's the right of my screen. And then you see Italian law enforcement there as well. But what you don't see on the other side of this gate there is a biometric sort of digital fingerprint system being deployed, wherein anyone who wants to come into the camp, which is run by, again, an independent international organization, needed to submit their fingerprints to law enforcement to get in or out. And this idea of biometrics, exchange of data, well, submitting data in exchange for shelter, food, and medical care was alarming, and it was something that again, despite the best intentions, well, these systems were being deployed without as much concern over what happens to that data, who holds it, who is it distributed to, who has access to it. Could it be used even inadvertently to cause harm? And this led me to write, in a response to another situation in Yemen, an op-ed in the New York Times, where in Yemen, without going into the details, a large humanitarian organization, in order to, in their minds, prevent fraud, implemented a digital identity system such that the Yemeni people who were displaced, who were in camps and shelters, needed to submit their biometrics in order to receive food. But again, going back to the importance of research, there was actually no research that I had seen, even though I asked for it, which was offered to that had even measured or even asked for the extent of fraud, and why this digital identity solution was necessary and proportionate. And so this idea of surveillance humanitarian, which is the deployment of these data collection technologies during times of crisis, that could actually increase risk and vulnerability to people in need, was again very alarming. And really what I was seeing is that, particularly in the humanitarian space, there was really not much. I mean, I'm talking about evidence-based research to inform decisions, but even when there was, even if we had the research, there was really a calculus that I was seeing being employed to weigh the benefits and costs of these digital identity systems. And even if risks and benefits and costs were the right way to go about thinking about that. And so, without this awareness, I had argued that, what was happening in this very small case in Yemen could be the, an extreme example of a larger problem, which is the creation of a digital underclass who are forced to hand over their personal data in exchange for basic needs, without dignity or control or agency. And it's even more alarming because this is where this work started to merge with my concerns over the AI, artificial intelligence, and the governance of new technologies. Because what we were seeing, despite the lack of evidence, even with digital identity technologies, which have been around for a while, there was an interest, and there still is, in deploying even newer emerging technologies in the migration space. And so we see an example here from IBM and an article in Science, which again is sort of allocating resources and determining the life path of people who are displaced, migrants and refugees, based on an algorithmic system which, is probably illegal in other countries. And so, and certainly probably the researchers wouldn't want those systems to be applied to their own children, let's just say in school systems or whatever. So, this was sort of alarming. And so, but it offered a way to think about how to do that calculus that I was talking about, and to think about how to govern this type of technological experimentation in the humanitarian space on people who find themselves in these vulnerable circumstances or who are marginalized. And with regard to technological experimentation in the humanitarian space, of course, we hear a great deal to the seminal research of Katja Jacobsen, who I think is the next door neighbor to Karlstad over in Denmark. And through that work, which had to do biometrics in the Afghanistan space and era, it remains important because migrants and refugees and those in these circumstances are becoming a real life open laboratory to test artificial intelligence and algorithmic systems. And so this led me to really thinking about what the value of a human rights-based framework could be in terms of governing artificial intelligence and the experimentation around artificial intelligence. And of course, well, not of course, in my, I would argue that human rights gives us a sort of already packaged international, I mean, with all the criticism around human rights framework, which I certainly understand, it does give us an international, legitimate, normative framework, politically legitimate, normative framework to guide AI development, which of course, AI depends on massive amounts of data collected about people's behaviors, expressions, and speech in order to detect, of course, patterns and make predictions for automated decision-making. And the sort of taking of that, well, many of us are concerned about surveillance and being used to gather up that data in our everyday lives, but and we oftentimes don't have a choice either. But when that's collected on the, those in refugee camps or in other types of circumstances, it's even more concerning. And so this idea of a strategy around AI experimentation based in human rights, it has been taken up by a number of professional societies like the IEEE, the largest sort of computer science and engineering society. Their first principle for AI design is sort of a recognition around that AI systems shouldn't violate fundamental international human rights law. And governments, like the Council of Europe, is developing a binding instrument on AI governance, which has to do with which is grounded in human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So, but again, I would argue that focusing our attention on the risks and harms of these AI systems, on those who are in these vulnerable circumstances like migrants and refugees, these edge cases, if you will, gives us critical insight and data and empirical research to inform how these systems could pose potential risks and harms for everyone, not just these edge cases, not just in the migration and refugee context. And so that was sort of a point that I was arguing amongst the policymakers for quite a while, but I just had not imagined that the day would come so soon that we would see the large-scale deployment of sort of surveillance humanitarian technologies or surveillance technologies under the, due to a global health crisis. And so I'm on the advisory board of the American Association for the Advancement of Science group which produced this report on AI and COVID-19. And part of this study, it's a long study, I won't go through it right now, but there was a deep concern about the surveillance applications with regard to privacy and data governance, things which are sort of important to these scientists. But again, the sort of discriminatory impact on marginalized populations, but also everyone else, because these were being these surveillance technologies are being deployed at scale. And another report that I'll just draw your attention to, this is also part of this network on public health surveillance and human rights of the Social Science Research Council in the United States, which produced this report on surveillance as the new normal in the COVID-19 era. And so just a couple of quotes that these technologies marshaled in response to the global pandemic are accelerating concern of this normalization of surveillance. So, you know, we've seen this surveillance for years in the migration space. Now it's being ported to this, you know, this more widespread space. And you know, I'm not talking causally here, of course, but you know, what is the relationship of this sort of experimentation amongst one group and then sort of normalization amongst large populations? I think is an area ripe for study. And then, of course, you know, this transformation of the social compact in terms of receiving healthcare in exchange for producing documents that prove your vaccination, such a very important question. You know, vaccination sort of immunity certificates and those things to travel. I mean, it's a very sort of contentious, but you could certainly see the benefits and harms on either side. But there is this sort of social transformation which is being, you know, hasn't been addressed as much, where people, particularly in under-resourced communities, are compelled to submit the constant surveillance in exchange for access to travel, movement, medical care. And again, this isn't in the migration space. This is sort of in all of our everyday lives now. So let me just end really where I began, which is, I think by emphasizing really to the researchers, of course, in the audience here today, the crucial importance of research on the risks and harms, but also let's not forget any empirically grounded benefits of this sort of technological development and deployment on the rights of displaced people and those who find themselves in vulnerable and marginalized circumstances. So, and again, this is where the sort of strategy comes in terms of policy. So with that evidence that you all, and of course my fellow panelists, have been developing, you know, let that serve to raise the alarm when to policymakers and practitioners when these technologies are deployed to the greater population, particularly in times of crisis and then sort of beyond that. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mark. This was really, really thought-provoking and important, and also kind of concrete examples why this is such an important issue today, especially today with the COVID crisis kind of intensifying these processes. Thank you. So now we will move on to our third paper by Martina Tazzioli and Anna Valdivia. Martina is lecturer in politics and technologies at Goldsmiths in London, and Anna is research associate at the Department of War Studies, King's College, London. And their paper will talk about making up migrants, invisible, foster and recraft racialized borders through artificial intelligence. So thank you, and the floor is yours, Martina and Anna.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to start, and then after about 10 minutes, I will hand over to Anna. First of all, let me start by thanking you for this kind invitation. And I think, for me and Anna, it's super helpful to present for the first time this paper and discussing this with you. So first of all, I want to say that this article stems from an interdisciplinary collaboration between computer scientist Anna Valdivia and myself, I mainly work on migration and borders with a focus on the Mediterranean region. And as part of this interdisciplinary encounter, we started to ask first, how can we rethink a critique of borders, right? And also an abolitionist critique of borders in light of the implementation of technology in refugee governance. And relatedly, what does it mean to engage in a critique of artificial intelligence by focusing on the racialized bordering mechanism that artificial intelligence enhance and at the same time invisibilize? So this paper is driven by these two questions, right, that come from these two disciplinary angles, and intervenes in debate on so-called techno-humanitarianism and warns against the increasing fetishism of technology in analysis about migration governmentality. So Anna, if you can move to the first slide. So this is a picture taken this summer during fieldwork we conducted in Greece, both on Lesbos and on the mainland, the Greek mainland. This is one of the the many refugee camps on the mainland, Malakaza, that has become like quite well known because it's one of those camps where Greek authorities are about to implement automated gates that asylum seekers might need to use for entering and exit the camp. So by scanning their asylum smart card and putting their their fingerprints at the gate. And actually, when I went there, however, these gates were not working at all. And I'm speaking about this because I think it's quite telling how this, as like this small episode reveals how this money that the European Commission put on like technologization and digitalization of asylum, sometimes, most of the time, also end up in this like technological glitches that some part are also the result of political conflicts, right, between like national authorities and European Union, or local authorities and national ones. So Greek island of Samos, September 2021, European authorities inaugurated the defense and high-risk security camp for refugees of Zevro, equipped with, I quote, turnstiles, magnetic gates, X-rays, two factors, access control system, identity and fingerprint, which secure and control entry and exit from the access center to whoever is entitled to it. The camp, which has been presented by the European Commission as a blueprint for other camps, has been the object of our criticisms by journalists, NGOs, and activists. And there have been many criticisms around the risk of this camp functioning as a panopticon for refugees. And more broadly, Greece has been defined as one of the many technological testing grounds, so where humanitarian and state actors test experiment technologies in the field of refugee humanitarians. However, in this paper, we kind of challenge this metaphor, and we point to the fact that this kind of criticism, right, for instance, around this camp in Samos, have mainly been centered around technologized surveillance. So this technologized surveillance has gained center stage both in academic and non-academic debates on migration and technology. Indeed, it's noteworthy that what triggered indignation among scholars and journalists was the technological surveillance rather than the condition of twofold carcerality that refugees experience in Samos, being confined on the island and inside an almost closed camp. And in particular, we think that it's super relevant to analyze how technology contributes to change the way in which carcerality is enforced. And so we ask, is actually technology primarily used for surveilling and tracking refugees in camp? So if you can please move to slide 2, Anna, thank you. So instead of taking surveillance as the main, or better, as the exclusive focus of analysis and concern, we ask, how has biometric changed the way in which migrant lives are governed, contained, and shown, and how are refugee subjectivity shaped? So our argument in this paper is that artificial intelligence contributes, artificial intelligence at the border, but also in the humanitarian setting, so in refugee camps, contributes to invisibilize, enhance, and recraft racialized border mechanisms. So in the paper, we address this point through a twofold move, methodological and conceptual move. First, we show that a juridical conceptualization of power directly or indirectly still underpins debates about AI and migration. And we call for moving beyond what Michel Foucault called a repressive hypothesis on power. And second, we call for disjoining a critique of AI at the border and the refugee camps from an exclusive focus on surveillance. It's important to stress that in the paper and in our research, we consider borders as not narrowed to national frontiers. In fact, we refer to heterogeneous racialized bordering mechanisms through which hierarchies among people are established and reinforced. So of course, these also include invisible borders and digital borders. So what does a critique of the repressive hypothesis entail? By speaking of a juridical understanding of power, we refer to the idea according to which power works essentially by prohibiting and repressing, and thus even resistance is mainly conceived as a refusal to this repression. So this is, in a nutshell, one of the theories on power and understanding of power that Michel Foucault notably criticized in The Will to Knowledge. If you can please, Anna, move to the next slide. So in The Will to Knowledge, Michel Foucault claimed that we need to cut off the king's head. In political theory, this has still to be done. Through this sentence, Foucault questioned what he called the repressive hypothesis, according to which power is conceived mainly in terms of prohibition and interdiction. Against this background, Foucault shifted attention to the productivity of power relations, focusing on the regime of knowledge and truth that are at play and on how subjectivity are shaped by power relations. So, of course, he didn't deny the existence of repressive mechanisms, but he pointed to the need of situating repressive mechanisms within a broader economy of power, which is mainly productive and which constantly transform the way in which subjects are crafted, and also the relationship between knowledge and truth is transformed. So first, I quote from Foucault, the notion of repression is quite inadequate for capturing what is precisely the productive aspect of power, reproducing a juridical understanding of it. Second, the notion of repression obfuscates, and I quote again, that what makes power all good, what makes it acceptable, is simply the fact that it doesn't only weigh on us as a force that says no, but it traverses and producing things, it induces pleasure, forms of knowledge, it produces discourse. Second point that I briefly introduced before, so critique of a juridical understanding of power and critique of the so-called repressive hypothesis. The second main conceptual thread of our paper that we demonstrate through specific empirical example that Anna will speak about consists in moving beyond an analysis which is exclusively centered on surveillance and to look at what technology is mainly useful. So, for instance, in relation to one of our case studies, Greece, we could observe during our fieldwork that technology widely implemented, because I have to say, for instance, in comparison to other refugee contexts like Italy, asylum seekers are confronted with technology on a daily basis. And however, this technology is primarily used for obstructing the access to the asylum procedure and the access to financial aid and humanitarian support. And of course, we're happy to discuss this more. So next slide. So through this paper, we aim at unsettling a citizen gaze on artificial intelligence, and in particular on artificial intelligence at the border, by taking the border as a privileged site of analysis to develop what Simon Brown defined as a critical biometric consciousness. So the border for us is not simply one among the many sites where we can test whether or not artificial intelligence and biometrics might be dangerous, but a site where our understanding, our gaze on this problem might change, and where we should stop seeing only as a citizen and starting also to seeing like a migrant, right? And for us, this means also questioning what does harm mean for migrants and asylum seekers who are targeted by this technology, right? Without taking for granted that question of informed consent and data privacy are the starting point, at least, of a critique of AI at the border. So radical questioning of the repressive hypothesis enables investigating the effects of subjectivation that are produced using AI. This means interrogating how this technology have altered the relationship between discourse, truth, and subject, and how they invisibilize, recraft, and enhance social injustice. Biometric and algorithmic systems are not simply deployed at the border, their implementation changed the way in which migrant subjectivity are shaped and what of the individual becomes object of control and data structure. So technology does not only target and surveil, but it also contributing to making up migrants. And now I hand over to Anna.
Thank you, Martina. So how does technology make up migrants? Nowadays, biometrics plays a key role on this matter, like Mark Latonero has previously highlighted. A biometric system is an application designed to automatically identify or authenticate an individual based on physical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics. These systems are developed using biometric images to train an algorithm that automatically match two biometric samples. Over the last 2 decades, deep learning has improved the performance of automatically extracting features from images. Designing biometric systems is not a trivial matter, since different aspects can affect the performance of the algorithm, such as image quality, expensive devices to get images, and computing machines in order to process the biometric data and demographic diversity. Equal base rates on the data are essential in order to avoid disparate impact or treatment. The awareness towards discrimination and bias in automated decision-making systems has increased, demonstrating that performance is very different depending, among other factors, on race, class, and gender. As a result, fairness has established as a new field in machine learning to study the bias and automatic discrimination of data and models. Thus, the narrative pushed forward by both states and the biometric industry is that it is important to design biometric systems based on fairness definitions to prevent a disparate impact. However, bias and discrimination in algorithmic systems reinforce the idea of automated repression, which hinders us from seeing that such discriminations are historical and structural. Biometrics has been always linked to a process of racialization, eugenics, science, and law enforcement. In fact, in the 1880s, Nature published a letter written by Henry Fowles in which he claimed that criminals could be identified through fingerprints. At that time, fingerprints and handprints were also used by British officers for the Indian Civil Service, matching the identity of colonial subjects with their jobs contracts to avoid fraud in India. Likewise, Francis Galton, who is nowadays considered the father of eugenics and biometrics, was looking for heritable characteristics of race. Galton started studying connections between fingerprints and facial images through statistics in order to find marks that could characterize and identify criminals. Soon after, in 1885, the first biometric system was introduced by a French police officer, Alphonse Bertillon, who created a method to classify criminals based on their physical measurements. Therefore, the implementation of today's biometrics-based systems at the border reproduces the scientific playground created in the 19th century. On the basis of the Dublin Regulation, EU member states are obliged to fingerprint migrants who enter the territory without authorization or who lodge an asylum application, and to send this biometric data into the Eurodac. As a result, a call for more transparent and more accurate biometric systems in the face of errors or bias is crucial for avoiding that some individuals are deported or put to jail because of a misidentification. There are also calls for more accountable and transparent systems. Yet, even if hypothetically it could be possible to get a perfect, fair, and transparent biometric system, the exclusionary politics is grounded in the very legal architecture of the EU border regime. Indeed, according to the Dublin Regulation, migrants cannot choose the country where to lodge their asylum claims, and more broadly, their unruly mobility is obstructed and illegalized through legal, political, and administrative measures. A clear example of how Europe is infringing a human right, the freedom of movement. Moreover, the racializing functioning of biometrics has a long-standing colonial history. And nowadays, this is replicated in the ways in which states use biometric systems for automating border violence against migrants in the name of security, innovation, and efficiency. Building on the repressive hypothesis, we claim that biometrics have been historically used to control and make up people, and in this case, to make up migrants. Through the extraction and storage of biometric data in large-scale databases, the EU is creating a new scientific classification that brings into being a new kind of person, or in this case, a migrant. A critical account of how algorithmic systems at the border beyond biometrics requires an accurate investigation of the discrepancies between political projects and their actual implementation. In fact, projects about high tech at the border are often announced, but then they are not fully implemented or end up challenged in the courts. The following two cases studies show how socio-technical systems invisibilize, foster, and recraft sedimented, racialized, and exclusionary bordering mechanisms. In 2016, the European Commission granted a proposal titled Intelligent Portable Border Control Systems, iBorder Control, with €4.5 million. They proposed to speed up border crossing, designing an automatic detection system to identify deceivers during border interviews through changes in eyes, voice, gestures, or postures. Despite a huge investment, both the methodology and the experiment proposed rely on statistical pitfalls and pseudoscience. The low number of participants, only 32, led to a poor representation of the population, which calls into question the generalizability of the algorithm. Moreover, the methodology draws on a contested scientific theory developed by Paul Ekman, who claimed that there are 6 universal human emotions and can be predicted from face expressions. However, different researchers have exposed in the last years that there is no evidence of emotion recognition, nor for automated affective detection. Therefore, the idea of predicting deception from facial microexpressions as proposed in the project should be also radically questioned. While a lot of attention has been paid both in academic and non-academic debates to how surveillance is enhanced through biometrics, it is a key to intervene such a discourse with an analysis of how socio-technical systems invisibilize and recraft racializing bordering mechanisms. The case of this EU-funded project clearly exposes that surveillance technologies are based in race scientific theories from the 19th century that have been revived with the resurgence of the trigon between security, efficiency, and artificial intelligence. But not all AI-based solutions designed for border control rely on biometric systems. In 2015, the UK Home Office implemented an algorithm named the streaming tool to automatically assess visa applications. The system was designed to calculate a scrutiny score based on historical data and key features of the applicant, giving a high punctuation if the application needed further examination and lower otherwise. However, the algorithm automatically identifies certain patterns in the past applications, such as some nationalities were more likely to obtain a higher scrutiny score than others, which created the feedback loop in the UK visa system. The streaming tool invisibilized structural discrimination at the UK border. The users of these systems found themselves totally defenseless against a visa refusal caused in part by automated system. 2 UK organizations challenged the Home Office in the court. As a result, the Home Office scrapped this system. The invisible harm that algorithms are causing nowadays can be confronted by litigations and exhaustive audit of the source code. Yet, governments and private actors are usually wary of displaying such code due to privacy and security concerns. In this work, we argue that critical investigation of the use of algorithmic systems in migration governmentality entails scrutinizing not only how these later are deployed at the border, but also how their implementation has transformed the ways in which power is exercised and resistance is enacted. By questioning the juridical understanding of power and the repressive hypotheses that underpin debates and literature on algorithmic surveillance, this paper opens up avenues for interrogating what a critique of biometric systems and AI in migration governmentality should be framed. Critiques of AI at the border conceive an heterogeneous racialized bordering mechanism, nowadays mainly focused on the ethics of AI. Yet, academic and public debates about AI at the border are partly overshadowing discussions about the unacceptability of borders as such. By retracing the colonial legacies of biometrics, Simone Brown has argued that it is at the border, territorial, epidermal, and digital, aside where certain bodies are cast out and made out of place, that a critical biometric consciousness could be developed. In fact, the border is not simply one of the many sites of investigation. It constitutes a case point in this. It constitutes a case in point. This paper has shown for excavating racialized exclusionary mechanisms without seeing like a state nor like a citizen. So thank you so much, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Martina and Anna, for your presentation. This was really, really interesting, and also providing such a historical background on this surveillance systems. And maybe if you can stop sharing, and we can move on to the other mode. Let me just change this. So now I think we can take on questions. If people have any questions for our presenters and would like to comment, or if you want to comment each other's presentations as well. While people are kind of maybe thinking what to say and still kind of digesting the presentations, what really struck me here is that the discussion about the borders becomes quite central here, but at the same time there is this idea that the borders are kind of dissolving. In a way, the borders are, because of the biometrics and digital media, the borders are not as physical perhaps as we've thought about them before. And this shifts the research also in terms of theoretically. So this is something I would like actually Sandra to comment on, because the way you frame the migration and mobility research coming together, how do you think this idea of the borders not being so central physically, but as a kind of digitally affects this idea?
Oh, thank you. Well, I always remember the Balibar definition: the borders are not being displaced or erased, but are actually becoming multiple and fragmented and internalized. So we don't think of borders as territorial anymore, but we see all kind of new layers being formed that can be, of course, infrastructural, but also psychological or emotional. What I see in this relation to the wonderful talks of Mark and Martina and Anna is the idea that there is so much obsession with the technological advancement, whether they can cause harm or benefits, but the idea of technology as a solution, a kind of way also of reorganizing the human species and our future, as somehow shadow, or is really creating a little bit of a darkening of what are the roots and causes of our current human conditions, and the way in which humanitarianism, of course, has the huge stains in development studies of being a source of exploitation and extraction once more. And so the datafication is becoming one more reason for reprogramming the role and importance of the Western countries, of whoever is in charge of technology and big tech companies on more vulnerable and expropriated groups. These do not need to be peripheral or migrant or marginalized. But I think it's important to see also within the weakened nation state. I mean, this has always been my approach in post-colonial studies, that you have to look at the multiplication of oppression and repression within a different level and different layers. So this never outsource it, never externalize it. We have this tendency of externalizing the border of Europe and seeing how far we can go in the mechanism, but we often forget that these mechanisms are very much in place at home as well. So this is my idea, that borders are not being erased or are becoming evanescent, but we should rethink the way in which they become more divisive and also more disguised, and in a way more threatening, because it makes it much harder to understand who is in control of what and how can we control these nefarious dynamics that the last two papers have been addressing. But I was very interested in what Anna and Martina was saying, in a way that's really this obsession with technologization is really taking our attention away from what the migrants might make themselves of these technologies. Sometimes they are not just maybe privacy or other things that we think are so monumental and important, but they might take out other things. So maybe my question was, how do you go about that? Do you, because I put so centrally the question of ethnography. How do you go about understanding what the migrants make of these new technologies and whether they feel so disenfranchised, they're operating under full consciousness for which they think, oh, it's good for us, but it actually is not. What is your strategy in order to have their voices heard, but also their take on technology and the way it is not universal or equal for everyone? I mean, I guess even among migrant, technology means different things according to their appropriation. So maybe that was a question for Martina and Anna, and also indirectly to Mark, whether we're not obsessing too much with technology and forgetting some of the historical structural things that are still at play.
We answer?
Yeah, sure.
I can say something about ethnography. Thank you for the comments and the question. And yeah, I absolutely agree with your point regarding how we could find this. First of all, yeah, I mean, going on the ground is absolutely crucial for not, and this maybe sometimes we manage to understand, but at least for questioning the extent to which our preoccupation, our concern about artificial intelligence, biometrics in camps at the borders can be extended to migrants themselves, not because they are different, and it's not a question of ontologizing migrants, but in terms of how these technologies affect them specifically as asylum applicants or as people who are being illegalized, turned into illegalized migrants and so on. And so I can give two concrete examples. One is about the use of, the fact that asylum seekers, not only in Greece, in many camps now have these like technological intermediation, which is this prepaid cards that they use in order to, that the humanitarian actors and in particular UNHCR give to them, and that is uploaded every month, right, with a small amount of money. And I remember when this was implemented first in Greece in 2017, there was all this concern, oh my God, how refugees might be tracked, their card transaction. And it's true that in part, this is something that UNHCR can do. This is something that I also try to investigate. And it's true that UNHCR can understand what these refugees are buying. But definitely, refugees, asylum seekers do not have this problem, right? Of say, okay, but is this card dangerous? Actually, if we look at the struggles, at the forms of like mobilization that refugees did, were all for getting this card, because the problem that they were excluded. So they didn't look at this card as a dangerous tool, right? The problem was how in order not only to get the card, but to get the money on the card, they had to comply with a series of spatial restrictions. And so looking at what they claim and what they mobilize for, we can also see that what are the main concerns. A second example is the struggles that many asylum seekers in Greece engage in against this mandatory Skype system to pre-book an appointment with the asylum service, so to lodge an asylum application. And in that case, the struggle was not against Skype as a potential source of surveillance or data extraction, but as Skype as a barrier. So as a further barrier for them to lodge the asylum application. And then on a more like general level, I would say, the fact that migrants soon after landing are fingerprinted, and in particular, I have in mind what happens in Greece or in Italy at the port. And of course, since then, their like digital trace is already like shared on a European level, and this is what mainly damage that, right? What they mainly care about. People who are forced to leave, to lodge an asylum application in Greece or in Italy because of the Dublin regulation, and this is what people voice, right? So their main concern is because we have been fingerprinted, now we cannot move freely, right? This doesn't mean that other concerns are not there, right? About being surveilled, being tracked. But the point is a question also of hierarchy and degrees, right?
Thank you, Martina. Is there something, Mark, you would like to add to this? There are also a couple of comments and questions that I will get back.
It's hard to add much more to what Martina said, and Sandra, just in her kind of response to you, also laid out a great deal of really insightful comments. I've often struggled with the undue attention that technology is given to people studying this, and in a practical sense, what I've seen in other iterations of a focus on technology with a sort of big social issue, it does sort of suck the energy and the money and resources to, studying the technological impact of X rather than the X. I think it's incumbent upon us as researchers to kind of not do what we are criticizing others for doing. So in other words, as the people on this call could probably, I think anyone who's done field research can understand how difficult it is to sort of weigh the balance of, should we get another interview? Is that extractive in and of itself? What is the benefit, of this research to the actual people that we are talking to? And that I think we all need to sort of think through that kind of inherent tension in the way we do our own research, but at the same time, trying to sort of elevate, as Sandra said, collecting the voices of those we are directing our sort of research attention to, without, of course, again, doing the same thing we're criticizing, sort of overgeneralization around a group just because we did we interviewed 150 people and did a quantitative survey kind of a thing. So, I think I don't have an answer, but I think it is important for each of us to struggle with these inherent tensions with our work and our findings, and how to really think about how what we do, how could it be helpful to those who we interview and such. So thanks.
Thank you, Mark. There are a couple of questions and comments in the chat. Comment on the emotion recognition as totally impossible and shocking that this could be funded as a technology. And Jenny's comment, Jenny Sundén, who commented on the what could be the points of intervention, for example, from the perspective of the migrants, exactly. Is there a possibility for alternative algorithmic imaginaries to emerge? Could it be that the master's tools actually can be used to dismantle the master's house or to lord it there? And if so, how? Interesting, important question. Does anyone have a comment on that? More than what we
I can comment on that.
Okay.
So I can say that yes, like AI can be used to challenge the power. And for instance, in the paper, we argued that with the streaming tool, because the streaming tool, so it was challenged by two UK organizations into the court, saying that the algorithm was discriminating, right? But what happened was that what actually the algorithm was doing is to show that in the past, the visa system in the UK was being discriminatory without the need of a technology, without the need of an algorithm. Because what happened was that the algorithm was showing that nationalities from Africa were having like higher score, high probability, they were likely to have like high score to be more scrutinized, right? And that's for me like the key point, right? Why it has not been challenged, that fact that in the past, like through this algorithm is showing that in the past, the UK visa system was discriminatory. And I think that this is how we can use algorithms to show how in the past we have been like, humans have been discriminating other humans, right? And then which other tools we can actually use, for instance, now in the project that I'm working at Security Flows, we are analyzing contracts of Frontex and EULISA, and we are unveiling which private companies are getting money for the developing of these technologies, to develop these technologies at the border. And I have been using digital methodologies like natural language processing, other algorithms to structure these contracts, to build a data set, and then with this data set, being able to run some analysis, some data visualizations in order to better understand this ecosystem of companies. So yes, technology can be useful for these kind of things.
Great, thanks, Anna. There is another comment that is more of kind of how we do research and how this kind of studies and approaches affect our own work and our own perhaps digital. Eileen is asking, may I please ask whether how your critique of technological fetishism and considering tech automatically as a solution has influenced your own research design and methodology? Are there, for example, tools or software that you would not use anymore?
So I think that maybe this is related with what Martina said at the beginning of the presentation, right? The fetishism of tech, but I think that she, well, you can say something, Martina. I think that she referred to the fact that nowadays technology is bringing the attention, right? Rather than why don't we discuss how borders are discriminatory by design. But in terms of software and tools, I would say I always like try to use open source tools, so not to use like these tools developed by big tech companies, but it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult. Like we are using now Zoom. So yeah.
If I can just add a point, yeah, I mean, the reference in the paper to this point, to the technological fetishism, is about, I mean, specifically about technology implemented in refugee governance, and is definitely, as Anna just said, about like this. I mean, that there is this overshadowing of critique of borders as such, whatever. I mean, any kind of borders, right? To the advantage of this centrality of technology, as if a technological solution or a technological fix to discrimination could solve the problem of exclusion in the asylum procedure, right? So detaching an analysis of, I mean, super important critique of technology from the legal architecture that, I mean, exclusion architecture that underpins the asylum system. For instance, in Greece, the fact that Greece declared Turkey a safe country in June 2021 has huge consequences on how asylum application are processed, and the fact that some asylum seekers can be preventively denied, so they are declared inadmissible. They cannot even apply for asylum, right? So of course, this is also further enforced through technology, but there is this legal architecture. And second point, I think that fetishism I referred to is also about not taking for granted that this technology work precisely in the same way that the European Union or UNHCR or national authorities tell us. And I took this example of like Malakaza refugee camp because it's quite telling, and it's not the only one, right? Of these like technology implemented with like money that comes from the European Commission and as part of big digital innovation programs, and then suddenly stop working or do not work yet, right? And I think is important to investigate when there is a glitch. If this glitch sometimes is the result of really technological disruption, or of course, in some cases is also for political reason, because some of these actors refuse to share data. And this is not a side effect, but is how, this technology at the level of like on a daily basis, working camps and interviewing UNHCR officers. They say very clearly, this technology is becoming very cumbersome. It's more and more difficult to manage asylum cases because, first of all, many of them are not familiar, right? Many of these officers, but also because there is more and more data to manage and the glitches are more and more frequent. So this is, it depends also on how you interview. If you interview the UNHCR headquarters in Athens, they have a different answer from Geneva, and definitely also a different answer from UNHCR people deployed on the ground.
If I could say one thing, sorry, Sandra. Sorry, Sandra.
No, you go first. Come on.
Okay, just real quick, and then I do have a question for you, Sandra. But I just think methodologically, I think the paper that Anna and Martina presented is sort of an expression of where I've sort of come to in terms of through the years of my research, which is this research really needs to combine social science and sort of legal studies and philosophy or what have you, and sort of computer science, and at least someone who knows about databases or knows about the more kind of technical in the sort of computer science sort of meaning of that word, artifact itself. And I think we open ourselves up to sort of undo an unnecessary criticism if we do not, because we cannot understand the sort of technical and the socio-technical without expertise in the technical. And so I'm not asking everyone here to get a computer science degree, but at least sort of partner with Anna or someone else to bring that to bear on our research. Because without it just, again, in terms of policymakers and practitioners, we really we sort of remain unconvincing. And so just in terms of methodology, bringing those two things together, I think is really important. Let me stop there, Sandra. Please go ahead, and then I have a question for you later.
No, thank you. I'm very, very glad for your comments, because indeed, what we try to do is not more an interdisciplinary approach, but more holistic approach to, and also historical and multi-layered, but also the idea that technology is moving so fast, especially artificial intelligence is becoming so specialized that you cannot keep the pace. So also, besides the fact that the innovation and technology going so fast, and without all the check and double check of the humanistic approach, of cultural studies approach that we could have with the ethical sources, there is more and more, I don't know what you think about it, this outsourcing. It's not only coming from the European Union, but this kind of private company taking over a certain role and function that the European Union or UNHCR cannot do anymore. And then you have not only the question of commercialization and outsourcing, but also how it's like a question of ethical breach, and also all these kind of blockchain and fraud and mistakes, and how they can be put under control. So you really have more and more a question of technology going forward, in the sense that there is no more meta level for checking the authenticity of it, the trust of it, but also what you said, Mark, also before, the question of whether it is damaging or not to the most vulnerable groups, but also whether it is useful at all. The techno-solutionism is that you use for the sake of experimenting because you want to find something new. And in the past, there used to be camps or colonies, and now we have the refugees. But what is the point of this? Where is this leading? If it's not, sometimes it's technology that dies out because it has not been efficient at all. And this obsession with artificial intelligence cannot be paced by people in the humanities or by people in the social sciences, as you say, not because you cannot program, but it's something which is so done by huge teams. So it's very hard to keep the pace. And how do we confront that, and what can we do about it? You know, because I think, as you say, rightly so, sometimes we criticize things we don't understand. Sometimes the technological aspect is so complicated that the critical analysis of it is far more behind. And by the time the technology has already shifted 10 times, and we're still trying to catch up with our analysis.
Thank you, Sandra. And yeah, this actually brought me to think about the fact that there are these different systems, because there are all different kinds of pilots and trials that are taking into use quite fast, and they make mistakes, and there are reports of these mistakes. So if there is for example, this deception, trying to detect deception in narrative, or speech detection that tries to kind of see if it's the accurate dialect and so on. And these have been developed quite fast, and they make mistakes. So what happens with these? How can these be sort of questioned? I think this is a big question also in this field. And Mark, you've been working in the humanitarian field, and so is there a kind of, to me, this is also a really interesting question about rights, because at the moment, there are many countries that make a certain exemption of non-citizens' rights who are trying to enter. So they don't have the similar rights, for example, the rights for data privacy and so on. So what happens when these things go wrong? What can be done?
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly, but let me just say that you know, what rights and human rights is sort of allowed sort of you know, me and others to do, particularly in the sort of emerging AI conversation, is to sort of short circuit the AI principles, ethics, proliferation of that discussion and ground it in something. Again, you know, human rights, we all know the criticisms of the human rights-based framework and such, but particularly with AI and, you know, this experimentation and that we've been talking about in the humanitarian space and others, it was what I saw was a focus on AI principles and ethics, not to say that those things aren't important, really left, I mean, AI has no oversight already. It really sort of, it opened the door for massive experimentation with no oversight at all, or sort of regulatory structure or governance structure around it. You know, I think asking what the human rights impacts are, and you know, the actual harms and the potential harms, and you know, we have years of literature around it and human rights impact assessments of those, again, sort of imperfect vehicles, but it does focus the energy a little bit more around particularly the burgeoning AI space, where it's sort of the Wild West in many ways. And I think, I think it's starting to take hold in some ways, again, from the the sort of policy discussions and people have been talking to. But again, I think it's sort of, having some type of, what we're really talking about is some oversight, regulation, constraints around the deployment of these technologies, and who would do it. Is it the international organizations? Is it governments? Is it states? Is it the businesses? But having some type of framework to really talk about those is kind of where I'm sort of what I'm getting at.
Okay, I see here another question commenting the discussion we've had. Humbert asking, why distinguish border criticism from technologized border criticism? Borders are not natural. Can we envision borders are a technological question? First primitive stone walls and now AI barriers.
Say something. Well, first it depends how we define technology. But I agree that definitely any border implies some kind of technologies, or at least political technology, but I don't think we can, at least in my view, a political understanding of borders cannot be narrowed to this technological component, even if technology is broadly understood not only as advanced technology or the high tech and whatever, but the technology, if the border has always been technological in this broad sense of the term, because it requires some infrastructure, digital or material and whatever, but also is based on, so the point is how this border technology enforce unequal access to mobility and impacts differently on individuals. So how the borders is used for creating and enforcing hierarchies of mobility and also in general of human being. And therefore the borders is not only always technological, broadly understood, but is always racialized and based on this discriminatory function, which is not, as many border study scholars demonstrated, is not about putting a barrier or only producing exclusion, but is also about filtering and producing exploitable bodies. So of course it's not only about like tracing division and exclusion, but still this complex functioning of the borders cannot be reduced only to its infrastructures.
Thank you, Martina, for that answer. Any other questions at the moment? Is yours, Sandra, is your hand old hand?
I have a quick question perhaps for Sandra, which is I'm sort of taken by this this idea of the kind of orientalization of the migrant or refugee in terms of kind of a digital subject, particularly with certain digital skills and like sort of putting that identity, forcing that identity upon them. Because we saw a lot, particularly in 2015, 16, this sort of move to try to train refugees to code and all of that. So I wonder, I don't know if that movement what happened to that exactly, but I don't know, how do you see those two things coming into play, and how is it, what are you learning in the course of your research?
Yes, on the one hand, it is the media perception of the migrants as being techno-savvy and therefore not being disenfranchised enough to enter Europe and to have the refugee rights, this kind of tech orientalism, kind of perception of the other, that they should be unable to be modern, to say simply. where we know that technologies are not only much more accessible and dispensable than it used to be in the past, but it's also ingrained and part of many digital native, a completely new generation that use it much more in other countries than in Europe. And I think Payal Aurora has written also a lot about this, about the use of digital media in the global South and all the kind of misapprehension and misunderstanding that we have about it, not only whether they have access or they have the digital literacies, but what they do with it. So it's kind of perception of the techno-Orientalism in that sense. The other is more what we said before, this idea of techno-solutionalism. So if we want to integrate migrants, the first thing that we need to do is to make them proper citizens, and to make them useful citizens. They need to be to have digital skills, because that will be the entry card to their mobility, work-wise, and integration, and also something that we can benefit from. So there have been lots of studies. Miria Georgos has worked a lot on this, about the rights to the city, and how groups in Berlin especially were trained in order to become digitally savvy. So yeah, you might think that this whole idea that technology can actually give you the entry card to anything. So there is this kind of Orientalism in both directions, the one against the other, that you assume are not equipped, and the other one home, in-house, in which we think that our future can only be digital in that sense. And if you don't have the skill of the knowledge of coding or digital infrastructure, then you're going to miss the boat in a different way, metaphorically speaking. And this, what I was saying, maybe it is without technological obsession, but on the other way, as I said before, things are moving so fast, and this might be the only way to be part of the game, but we might be losing on many other form of participation and integration that might be, as I think Martina was also mentioning, in different contexts, essential to a healthy multicultural society, we want to call it. I don't know what other people think about this, but.
Thank you. Thank you,
Sandra. It's paradoxical that I say with a project which was focused on the digital, but my idea was the digital not as a solution and not as a kind of different lifestyle, but it was the digital as very much banal, mundane, and everyday, and integrating with offline. So that was my demystification of the digital.
And I think with the ethnographic work, it becomes obvious that it is in many ways banal and part of the everyday life, and it has many meanings in our lives, the digital. But whereas we see, what I think this also what we've talked about in this seminar is how also the different ways in which technology is being used as a kind of biopower has also become part of it's more and more difficult to distinguish from the everyday life, or see. It has become also invisible to some extent, and it's something that follows people wherever they go, which causes many problems with the embedded biases and so on. But yeah, I think to me that kind of ethnographic approach can perhaps reveal more of those nuances as well that you, Sandra, were talking.
Can I ask something to Mark about the COVID project and this idea that we're now having this, how do you say, datafication of not of the vulnerable, but the white or the global people, whatever. Is this a new fear? Because I think that always been the case. I mean, also in the past with all kind of statistic and the governmental gathering. What does the COVID, why does the COVID create so much more panic than other data system? the idea of the vaccination pass and all these kind of things is creating completely hysteria and polarization in society because of the right to privacy. Whether we never had the right to privacy, I mean, was much more invisibilized, but very much present.
I don't know if it's necessarily new, but it's a little bit more about the newly development and deployment of untested technologies that are being rapidly adopted. And I think it's a little bit more on that scale. It's a normalization of surveillance, yes, but also just the normalization of this mode of not necessarily subjecting people to, but well, I mean, if you look at the entities and organizations developing these technologies and deploying them, and the contracts that governments are sort of issuing to these private, the private sector is a worry, because of course, you know, they do have the skill set and the resources to deploy certain COVID surveillance technologies to an entire population of millions of people, but there's very little oversight, and in fact, some of the contracts say that they cannot be sued. You know, there's a lot of like technical aspects which absolve them of responsibility and oversight and regulation. So it's sort of an extension of that, which has sort of created a lot of worry.
Sorry, Kaarina, for interrupting.
No, not at all. Well, the thing is that we've now reached the end of our seminar time, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for really wonderful talks and discussion. Really enjoyed this, and it gave so much to think about for the future research, and I hope you all enjoyed this. And fortunately, the ones who couldn't make it today can also see this in Geomedia YouTube channel. So thank you for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
You all, thank you.
Bye.
Bye, and hope to see you again soon.